Hello everybody, my name's Tom and I'm going to be talking to you today about talk for learning. So the focus is going to be on creating the right conditions in the classroom for effective classroom talk. I'm going to go through a few different things. Just by way of a brief introduction, I'm currently team leader for history at Cedars, but I also work within the trust as an SLE for Oracy. What we're going to be focusing on today is introducing a bit of a rationale for having more talk in the classroom. We're going to have a look at the challenges that are posed by doing that, and then we're going to look at some of the practical solutions that we can put in place to make sure that all students are benefiting from the transformative impact that effective classroom talk can have on their learning. So just to begin with, I wanted to start off by being perfectly honest. None of the ideas that I'm going to share with you during today's session are my own. I have magpied them from various different places. I just wanted to highlight some of these books before we start. I think if you're new to Oracy and you want to understand more about the rationale behind it, but also the practical things you can do in the classroom, I'd really strongly recommend the Transform Teaching and Learning Through Talk book by Amy Gaunt and Alice Stott. They're both associated with School 21, Voice 21, who are kind of the leading lights, as it were, in the world of Oracy within the UK. So I'd really encourage you as a starting place to go and look at that if you want to find out more. The other books, Fear is the Mind Killer and A Dialogic Teaching Companion, are two of the books that I've found really useful on my Oracy journey, as it were. So I just wanted to start off by signposting those areas where you can find more information, and just to make you aware that none of the ideas that I'm going to go through are my own. Also, just to highlight the Oracy Cambridge website as well. They work closely with Voice 21 and are really useful as a place where you can go and find out more information. Okay, right. So let's get cracking with a bit of the overview. First off, let's start off with what is Oracy. Now, it's one of those terms that some people like, some people don't. And I'm sure all of us within our different school contexts have been hearing a lot more about it in recent months, recent years. Essentially, it's the direct, explicit teaching of speaking and listening as part of the curriculum. In a nutshell, that's what Oracy is. So it's just trying to make sure that our students are using their voices more in class, as something that we're teaching as part of the curriculum. Now, as part of this, there's lots and lots of different types of talk we could be focusing on today. Public speaking, or what's called presentational talk, or debates, which are what's called disputational talk. Now, when I talk to teachers and people within schools about Oracy, quite often those are the things that come to mind. And you hear people saying, well, we're running a debating competition, or we do a bit of public speaking in our classes. Now, that's fantastic, but often I think it's missing the most effective type of talk for helping students learn, and that's using discussion, or what's called exploratory talk. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today during the session today. Okay, so let's have a think about the rationale then for why we're doing this. If we want to dedicate really precious lesson time to this, we need to understand that it's going to be effective in helping our students learn. Unfortunately, there are lots of pieces of evidence to suggest that if we do Oracy effectively in the classroom, then it can really benefit our students. So the first thing I wanted to show you was this is a clip from the Education Endowment Foundation's website. So the foundation was set up in order to identify those things that can really positively benefit students, especially those students who are from disadvantaged backgrounds. So what you can see in front of you here is what the page which describes how much evidence there is to support a particular kind of intervention, and then the impact it can have. And we can see that oral language interventions can have a really significant impact on students for what is a very low cost as an intervention. What I've also done there is highlighted collaborative learning approaches, which also demonstrate a significant potential impact on students' learning, again, at a very low cost. So we can see here that these two interventions, which both rely on students using their voices, can have a really important impact on student learning. What this demonstrates is that if we are getting students using language effectively in the classroom, it's clearly having a positive impact, or can clearly have a positive impact on what they learn. I also wanted to show you, this is a clip from John Hattie's work. So John Hattie's visible learning work. He went away and looked at 252 different things that teachers, practitioners do, both within the classroom and outside the classroom, and whether they had a positive impact on student learning. Out of those 252 different things, classroom discussion is in the top, I think it's 16, I haven't counted them properly, but the top 15, 16 things that you can do. I'll let the eagle-eyed amongst you work out whether it's 15 or 16. But we can see again that using language effectively in the classroom clearly does something to student learning. It clearly does something to student attainment. So clearly, from an attainment perspective, there's research there to indicate that if we're using language effectively in the classroom, then it has a positive impact on what students learn and how they learn. But I just wanted to connect you very briefly with the consequences of us not doing that effectively. Now, a recent report, Now the Whole School is Reading, from the UK government, identified the fact that 10% of disadvantaged children leave primary school with their reading age below the expected standard to get passes in English and maths. So clearly there's a real need to make sure that students are having as many different opportunities to develop their language, their reading as possible. And the consequences for that not taking place are quite clear. So the Ministry of Justice highlighted how 7% of adult prisoners had a reading age, literacy levels below those expected of an 11-year-old, and that a quarter of young offenders have a reading age below that of an average 7-year-old. So there's really significant consequences for not helping our students to learn how to read, how to write, how to speak effectively. And if we use Oracy education, then it can really help to close that gap and to make sure that more students are leaving school at the required levels. And obviously, I'm sure we've all heard that fact that the number of words that a child has heard and can say beyond the age of 3 is a really powerful predictor of later language development. This is all kind of putting the case in for greater time spent on Oracy within the classroom, both at primary, before primary, and then also after primary as well. Now, often people distinguish between literacy and Oracy, but actually the two are really closely intertwined. And what you'll generally notice is that if you improve one, then you help to improve the other. I also wanted to draw your attention to the work of Neil Mercer and James Mannion, who worked with the Cambridge Oracy Project. They did some work for the Welsh Government where they basically went through the research literature on Oracy education. And what they identified was that it has a number of positive impacts, both from a cognitive perspective, a social emotional perspective, and also a life outcomes perspective. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these because you can see them on the screen, but just some of the benefits that the research literature has indicated exist as a result of Oracy education. I'm sure we can agree we want to see far more of them from a teaching perspective. So things like better engagement in lessons, better focus on tasks, improved self-esteem, better confidence, higher emotional intelligence. And then obviously in life outcomes at the bottom, we see absolutely amazing things with overcoming social disadvantage, fewer exclusions from school, improved future earnings. All of these things have been linked to better Oracy education within the research literature. So I'm sure we can see that from an attainment perspective, from a life chances perspective, if we can get Oracy right, it can have a really powerful transformative effect. Now, the final area it's worth touching upon is the jobs market. Now, I don't want to suggest that in schools all we're doing is producing the next generation of workers, because that's not what I think, and I'm sure a lot of you will agree, that's not what education is all about. But we as educators need to make sure that we are helping our students once they've left us to enter the world of work. That's an important feature of what we're doing. And it seems increasingly like what we are doing in schools isn't necessarily helping them to do that. That was really recently highlighted by the Times Education Commission, a recent report that they did in 2022. Sir Charlie Mayfield, who used to be the chairman of John Lewis, and then also the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, warned that the gap between education and the world of work was getting larger and larger. He said they are more separate than they've ever been. Standards in education have always been measured by exams, assessments, and grades, so it's not surprising that this has been the focus. However, this is increasingly at the expense of what employers really value: resilience, communication, and problem solving. So we can see communication is a key feature of what it is that our students are going to need in the world of work. It's something that isn't necessarily given the time needed within the classroom. That's backed up by the CBI, so the Confederation of British Industry. Every year they'll do a report, and part of that will touch upon what they think of students who are leaving school and students who are leaving university. 74% of them in 2021 said that employers are satisfied with the academic knowledge of young people. So we're doing a good job on the academic side, but a significant number, 40%, felt that communication and teamworking skills were not up to scratch. And 69% of them, so a huge chunk of employers, say that it's soft skills and those kind of behaviours, communication, teamwork, are the most important thing that they're looking for, even more important than literacy and numeracy. So I'm not suggesting that we need to just abandon literacy and numeracy and we need to focus more on communication and teamwork. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying, what I am asking is, are we doing enough to help our students develop those skills that the world of work are really crying out for? So we've talked about some of the reasons why we might want to introduce Oracy from an attainment perspective, and then from a wider life chances perspective, including in the job market. It's clear that communication is important for our students going forward, and it can help them learn better. But I'm not naive. I know that it poses significant challenges within the classroom. Now, first off, one of the biggest challenges is that students find it hard. It's difficult to do, especially once you get into secondary school. I know I've experienced it, but I know not a lot of other teachers will have experienced that it's difficult to get students to talk effectively. They don't like it. It makes them uncomfortable, especially in year 10 and 11. It can pose a real challenge. So coming up against student resistance can be one of the big challenges, which can also lead into the second challenge, and that's behaviour. It can be really difficult with some classes to instigate the kind of approaches that I'm going to discuss in a minute effectively in the classroom. If you can't trust your students, how are you going to trust that they're doing the right thing in a discussion-based task? So behaviour can cause some problems as well. Another problem is assessment. How do we assess it? It's quite difficult to assess Oracy properly, and as a result of that, it doesn't leave a paper trail, or can often there'll be gaps. And what another issue we come up against is quite often the learning that takes place in a lesson is demonstrated through writing in books. So if you're not doing the writing in the books, how are you demonstrating learning? So there can be a problem with a lack of paper trail and a lack of that ability to audit what's taking place. And the other thing, I think the other barrier is that it requires a new style of teaching. In recent years, there's definitely been a push towards more teacher-led activities within the classroom. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wholly a bad thing, but what it has meant is that there's less time for student discussion within classrooms. The teacher's doing more talking, it makes sense that the students are doing less talking. So it requires a new style of teaching, and that requires teachers to do a bit more learning, which is difficult because there's not necessarily enough time. It takes time and no one's got time. So I'm not going to be able to address all these challenges in today's session, but I'm going to try and address as many of them as possible as we go through. I also wanted to just identify the fact that Oracy has been woefully, I think, underserved in our education system for quite a while now. And that's backed up by research from a number of different areas. So the recent report in 2021 from the all-party parliamentary group on Oracy said that the status of it within the architecture of our education system does not reflect its value and importance to young people's outcomes in school and life. So we're not devoting enough time to Oracy, basically, according to this recent report. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because it doesn't really form part of testing. And we all know that what gets tested is what gets taught. Spoken language has next to no impact on students' GCSE results. Yes, it forms a part of GCSE English, but not a hugely significant part. They just need to make sure they do it, and then they can get their GCSE in English. But it doesn't really count towards the grade they get. It doesn't really play a role in other GCSE subjects or A-level subjects, unless you're doing something like drama or a language. So within a huge chunk of the curriculum, it doesn't feature, and as a result, it doesn't really get taught. And that's reflected in Ofsted as well. So 2019, so before COVID, only 8% of Ofsted inspections mentioned Oracy or like terms. So we can see that from an architectural perspective, the education system just does not promote the use of Oracy in the classroom. But hopefully by now, I will have made you think about how important it is for the life chances of students, and then also how it can help with their attainment. So what I'm trying to say is we need to push past these issues because it's such an important thing, and hopefully I've made that argument for you with you today. So let's have a think of some of the solutions that we can use if we are going to try and introduce more speaking and listening in the classroom. So what can we do? Well, we can increase the quantity and quality of talk in the classroom. We can use a dialogical approach, which is going to reach all students in every lesson. What I'm going to talk about today are using talk rules to do this and using talk roles to do this. So these are things that I think if all schools were doing effectively, then it would have a really profound and transformative impact on our students. So the first one, we're going to talk about talk rules. Now, some of the challenges we talked about were students not liking it and not wanting to feel like they're discussing, and then behaviour. And I think that talk rules can be really useful in tackling those two problems. In order for students to feel safe and secure and to discuss and to open up and to put themselves out there, they've got to feel comfortable in the environment that they're in. And talk rules can really help to create that environment. Now, I think within schools, we've got a bit of a tendency to give students rules and say, look, you need to abide by these rules. And there's definitely places where that's necessary, but I also think we need to open up the idea that students should have a role in creating their own rules. And I think this is a really important place where we can do this. So what I'm going to show you is how, if I was going to introduce talk rules to a class, how I would do it within the lesson to create co-constructed rules. So not just me saying, this is what you need to do, but actually co-constructing the rules. But I'm equally aware of the fact that you kind of want to give them the guides, and you want to make sure students are going to come up with sensible things. So this is co-constructed rules, but where you're giving students a really heavy guide in the sorts of rules you want them to come up with. So it's kind of a win-win. So this is what it would look like if I was going to introduce it. I've called it a discussion agreement. If you want to call it talk rules, then you can. I just find rules a bit more authoritarian. I don't know why, but it's just a preference to call it an agreement. So what I'd start off with is by saying, look, we're all governed by unwritten rules, and much of the time we're not really aware that these are taking place. So then I'd do a hands up, hands down activity on whether they think these rules are a good idea. So I'd run through getting them to say whether they think these ideas are good or bad. Now, often, I think most of the time they keep their hands down. They say it's not good ideas. What you tend to get is certainly boys might put their hand up to say that they don't disagree with your friends, back them up at all times. They think that that's a bad idea, and they think that you should back up their friends. I don't know if it's a bravado thing, but if you say, but even if you didn't agree with them, then often that gets them to rethink. And then you can get them working in twos or in threes, just to say, if you live your life by these unwritten rules, what issues is that going to cause you? And you can have a really good discussion on how it's going to hold you back. You're not going to learn effectively. Your good ideas may never make it out there into the world. And you can have a really profitable discussion on how these are bad rules to live by. And also make the point that for a lot of them in your classroom, they'll be living by these rules without really realizing it. So then I'd put this up on the board and I'd say, right, if we're going to come up with a discussion agreement as a class, what would a better agreements look like? Again, keep them working in 2s or 3s, and then ask them to just come up with 2 or 3 things that they would add on to a class rule list. Get them to write it down on a scrap piece of paper. You'll probably have about 10 groups, maybe 15 if they're working in pairs. And they'll all write down 3 to 4 things in a positively phrased way. So we will do this, or we should do this, just to make it a positive thing. And then what you'll come up with, you take those all in as a teacher, and then you can kind of condense them down into a list of ideas that you would want to promote. So these are often the kinds of ideas that you'll get from it. You might not get them all, so you might want to suggest them to the group when you're discussing them, and they can either accept them or reject them. But you'll come up with your own discussion agreement from this. It takes about 10 minutes to run it in a lesson when you're running it with Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 students, in my experience. So it doesn't need to take very long. Then what you can do is you can display the rules prominently somewhere in the classroom, or if you work with PowerPoint, you could put them up at the start of your lesson and just say, look, as a reminder, these are the rules that we've all agreed that we want to do. And you can use them as a tool to just bring students back. If they've ever gone off topic, if they're ever not pushing themselves to say what they think, you can bring them back to their rules. Are you living by what we said we'd agreed to? I find them really useful at the end of the lesson as well. And you can use it as a bit of a tool to encourage metacognition, getting students to think about their own learning and how what they've done, whether what they've done is a success or whether they could perhaps improve it next time. And you can highlight students who have done really well in the lesson, and you can question them and say in front of the class, why have you done well? What have you been doing that's encouraged you to do this? And I find them a really useful tool to just keep students going with the idea that discussion is important and it's something that they want to get better at. And it helps to create that culture of learning and that culture of supportiveness within the classroom. So discussion rules, first place you can start. I'd encourage you to all go and get those in place within your classrooms. So the other thing I wanted to talk about are talk roles. Now, these have come from, what you can see on the board has come from Voice 21. So the charity that was set up to support the promotion of Oracy around the country. And they've basically identified 6 different roles that you can take on in any discussion. What you often hear from students is they don't know what to say in any given situation. They don't know how to move conversation forward profitably. And what these roles help students to do is to give them the tools that they need in order to do that. So let's look a little bit further at how we can go about getting them to use them effectively. Now, I know some of you will be looking at this and thinking that having these different roles within the classroom might look a little bit more clunky, and it might take a little bit of time and it'd be a little bit unnatural from a conversational perspective to begin with. And yes, it is. They are clunky. When you start using them, it is a little bit unnatural. But the more you use them, the more you engage with them as a way of structuring discussion and debate, the more effective they become. So I'll show you in a minute how to go about using them in a classroom. I just want to highlight the role of summarizer and how important that is in the classroom. One of the big problems that students have in engaging in discussion profitably is that they don't listen to one another. And I say students, but I also mean adults in that context as well. We don't listen. We're not very good at listening to each other, and that is a real barrier to effective communication. So the role of summarizer helps to get around that. What you'll do is, and I'll show you it properly in a minute. But what you'll do is you'll have someone summarize the discussion that they've embarked on with their group, and it encourages them to listen carefully to what each other are saying. So I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. But I also wanted to just talk briefly about groupings and how you go about grouping students for this. There's lots of different ways to doing it. If you look at Voice 21, there's loads of different ideas for how you can group students. What I'd say is, what I found most profitable is allow them to start with groupings they feel comfortable with. So get them to sit with their friends, but make it really clear to them that you're doing this just to begin with, and that you want them, come the end of term, come the end of this half term, to be able to move around the room and work comfortably with anyone in the room, because that's what's going to benefit them in the long run, being able to work with anybody. So get them start them off comfortably, but then always keep in mind that they're going to be moving towards being able to work with anybody. Now, obviously, if behaviour is an issue, fix the groups for them. But if you're able to, let them start with who they want to work. Okay, so this is how I would introduce this if I was teaching it. Now, it goes without saying that there is absolutely no point in getting students to discuss from a topic perspective, so from like a history teacher's perspective or a geography teacher's perspective, until they've got the requisite knowledge. So this is going to sit at the end of a scheme of learning. Maybe you've done a whole topic and you want to make sure they understand it, or maybe they've done some learning within a lesson and you want to demonstrate understanding and enhance understanding from that. So they've got the knowledge down first. You need a question. Quite often statements and then do you agree is a more profitable way of doing it than just a straight question. But put your question up on the board. The more engaging it is, the more interesting it is, then the better. What you're going to do is break your groups into A, B, and C if you're working in threes, or if there's more, then you can break it down even further, or A's and B's if you're doing it in pairs. Then you say, right, give yourself a letter, A, B, or C. And then you say, right, A, you are going to be initiating the conversation. And you might have those talk roles in front of them so they can see the sentence starters. I'll also put them up on the board to help them, so we can see this sentence starters to help with that. I'd also encourage them to think about tentative language. Often they'll say, I don't know what to say. But if you can encourage them and just say, well, you don't have to be sure, you don't have to be 100%. More often than not, people aren't 100%, but you can use tentative language as a way of carefully introducing yourself into a conversation. So you can give some examples up there on the board. So you get the initiator to start. Then you get someone to build on their ideas or challenge them in a respectful way, or clarify them if you want to use clarifier, however you want to do it. Give them a sentence start for that as well. Then you can get them to continue the discussion. So C can add in information if they wish. And then the summariser is going to repeat back. I'd let it run for 3 minutes or so. You don't have to let it run for a long time. It can be quite a quick thing. But C is going to summarise back what they've heard, encourage them, push them to give specifics. What did specific members of their group say? What you'll find often to begin with is they'll just say what they think, but push past that and say, right, what did so-and-so say? What did the other member of your group say? And then you can ask them, if you want to engage in a bit of deeper questioning, is what they think, and they can think on the spot of what they think. Now, the reason you want those specifics is that that's going to encourage people to really listen carefully to what one another's saying. So once you've done that, let it run for about 3 minutes. Sorry, there's the sentence starters for those summarizers. But once you've let it run for 3 minutes, you can keep going. You can give them another role and another question, and then you can get them to split up and take on new roles. And the same thing again there, we've given them another question to think about. And that's getting them to practice those different skills. Now, we can see that by structuring those conversations, each one of them is going to get practice at doing different things. That is all going to benefit them with their learning and their verbal skills, but it's also going to deepen their understanding of a particular topic. And you really do see this when they come to do the written work. If you've done speaking beforehand, for people who do things like English and history and all of the humanities, you see a real much richer writing as a result of them speaking through it beforehand. So different ideas where we could introduce this dialogic approach. You could have them solving problems in maths and science. You could watch a video and then get them to make sense of it as a group. You can discuss the meaning of texts or big questions, or within all subjects, you could prepare an answer to an exam question and feed back in together as a group and come up with a group answer. Whatever you do, the more interesting the stimulus, the more profitable the discussion is going to be, obviously. Makes sense. So just a word of warning. Obviously, I've said already that it requires perseverance because students don't like it and it requires a new type of teaching to be successful. So you've just got to persevere with it. Don't give up if it doesn't work at the first few weeks of trying it. It goes without saying as well that the earlier you embed this with younger years, the better. So if I work at an upper school, so if we can embed this with year 9, then it's going to be much easier once those year 9s go into year 10 and 11 for them to engage profitably in discussion. Trying to embed this straight away with year 11s, you're going to find it very difficult because they're already used to a specific way of being taught. And with year 10s and year 11s, they're probably at peak awkwardness for working with groups. So the earlier you can embed it, the better. And then just a word on quiet students. There were quiet students, and then there are students for whom doing speaking within class causes them significant amounts of anxiety. Students with social anxiety disorder will find this really difficult. They can do it, but they're going to need support to do it. So you might want to think of ways that you can adapt these things to help those students who are really going to struggle. I've found that speaking to them beforehand, signaling the fact that it's going to happen, asking them what groups they want to work with can all be really profitable ways of doing that. And also that really clearly signposting them beforehand if you're going to ask them to contribute in front of the group. So if they've taken on the role of summariser, you might go to them beforehand, get them to summarise to you, give them a real confidence boost, so that's really good, and then ask them to contribute before the group. That could be a really good way of getting them to do that. Just make it clear to them as well why you're doing it. It's really important for them for the rest of their lives that they're able to do these kind of things. So I just wanted to make you aware of what we're doing at Cedars. So we're rolling out these things at Cedars in lessons at the moment with a working group. We want to put together something for a more comprehensive whole school approach. But first, it's really important to work out what's good and what works within our Cedars context. So we're put together a working group. That group consists of people from all different subjects. And they're going to feed into this whole school approach for 2023, 2024. So watch this space for how the Oracy approach develops as we go forward. So thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, then you can contact me through contacting the teaching school. I look forward to working with as many of you as possible in the coming months and years to try and make sure that we are reaching as many of our students with effective classroom discussion activities as we possibly can. Okay, thank you for listening.